Okay, to finish off the microevolutionary processes that can change genetic frequencies, we're going to go over natural selection, and you'll see there's different forms here. And then we'll also go over another type of natural selection referred to as sexual selection, and that actually models back to the non-random mating processes that can also change genetic frequencies. So let's start with natural selection. So this is a process that leads to adaptive change. It's the process in which if you possess beneficial traits that are heritable, meaning we get them from our parents through the generations, they can actually become more common in successive generations. Because if they're more beneficial to you in the environment, that means that you're able to utilize the environment better. And so if you can do that, that means you're getting more food, you're staying away from predators. More food means more energy, and more energy means that you can find more mates. And if you can find more mates and or have more offspring, then you're going to pass those beneficial traits on. Okay? If you possess a detrimental trait, they can then become less common, because maybe it's a trait that doesn't allow you to get away from predators. Well, you're going to die out and take the allele with you. Or if it's a trait that doesn't allow you to get as much food, right? If you eat less, you have less energy and you have less of ability to find mates. You might do some mating, but you wouldn't be able to have as many offspring, and over time they wouldn't be able to have as many offspring, so they wouldn't be able to pass on that detrimental trait as readily as the adaptive trait. So again, adaptive change means that natural selection is acting on an organism's phenotype. Okay, so that's different than mutation. Mutation is acting on the genotype. It's acting on the specific gene. But we know that mutation is a way that we can get new genes, different alleles, right? And so if that occurs, then we express a different phenotype. If that phenotype is more adaptive in the environment, then we're changing because of natural selection. Okay, so they are, everything is related to one another. Okay, so natural selection, we can look at it in several ways. So we're going to look at these different processes, types of natural selection, called directional selection, stabilizing selection, disruptive, or sometimes called diversifying selection, and then also balancing selection. So these types show the patterns that develop as to which phenotypes are more frequent or successful. So it's a nice way to look at these is graphically, okay? But then we'll also place an example with them. So in these two graphs, they show that individuals at one extreme of a phenotypic range have a greater reproductive success in a particular environment. So what do I mean by extreme of a phenotypic range? You can see in the upper picture, there's mice that are variable from white mice to black mice, right? You can see the one individual of a black mouse in there. And so that's displaying one variation. Instead of having an equal distribution of light fur to dark fur, you can see an extreme of the one population having white fur. And so based on the graph, you can see at the x-axis shows that range from light fur to dark fur, and on the y-axis it's the number of individuals that possess that trait. So we see that large increase of light fur, that's a directional selection. Now let's say something in the environment happens that causes the darker furred mice to become more successful. We're going to see a shift in the number of individuals that possess that trait. So the phenotypic trait is moving in one direction. It's shifting to a direction of darker fur. Okay, so what could that be? Well, maybe these are mice that are living in an environment that has more of a sandy ground color, and so light fur is an advantage in this environment, because when the hawks are flying overhead, it's hard to see a mouse with light fur against that light colored ground. whereas a mouse with dark fur would really stand out. Okay, so therefore, the advantage of having light fur is that you avoid predation. If you can avoid predation and you're not trying to hide all the time, you probably find more food, you have more energy, you find more mates, and you have more offspring, and that trait gets passed on to more individuals in the population. Okay, but maybe now something happened. This is an area near a volcano, and the volcano erupted and it spewed volcanic ash all over the ground, and now the ground is dark, and the ground can permanently become dark. Well, suddenly those mice that had dark fur, the hawks can't see those guys anymore. So they've got the advantage in the population, and they're avoiding predation, so they're able to pass on their alleles to successive generations more readily than those with the light fur. So this population, we see directional selection. The population now, the allele frequencies are changing toward the direction of darker fur. Here's another example. This is a classic example of directional selection, and if you study animal behavior, you go through and you study the pepper moths. So pepper moths are a moth of Great Britain. The whitish color is the most abundant form, and you can see why. If you look at the picture in the upper left, these moths like to hang out on birch trees. Birch trees are common in Great Britain, and the bark of the birch tree is very light in color. So you can see in that close-up in the upper left, I had to circle the pepper moth to make sure that you guys saw it. That lighter color blends in with the tree so well. There are variations in the population, and so some individuals get the allele for dark color. And you can see that moth pretty well next to him, and so can a bird. A bird would be able to see that moth pretty easily and pick it off. Now, the black allele survives in the population because if you look at the picture to the right of the trunk of the birch tree, you can see that there are areas of the birch tree where there's just these black scarring on it. And so the dark moth sometimes can mimic that black scarring, and so predators might miss them. But mostly, predators can see the dark ones better than they can see the white ones. So the pepper moth, more frequent genotype was this light color, or I should say phenotype was this light color in the environment for a long time, and even in the cities. But then in the early 1900s, the Industrial Revolution hit. And that means that we were building factories, and we weren't very good at building factories back then, or the energy we used was basically from coal and things, and that spewed a lot of soot into the environment. And so what happened is, you can see in the lower picture on the left side, is that the soot coated the trees, the bark of the trees, so they became to look more black in color. Well, now the advantage shifted in the different phenotypes of these moths. So the light color moth can now be easily seen on the bark of the tree, whereas the dark color moth blends in and birds can't see it very well. So the dark color moth is the melanic form. Melanin is a dark pigment that a lot of animals produce to look dark in color. And so that one now is not as rare in the cities. It shifted because the environment shifted, and due to natural selection, those now that had the darker color survived better. So in the cities, you see more. We saw a phenotype shift, frequency shift. Along with it went the genotype and allele frequency shift in the cities. But in the forests, where it's still pretty clean and the birch trees still have the light color, the white form is the more common color. Okay, so that's directional selection. Okay, in stabilizing selection, so again, a form of natural selection, but what happens with stabilizing selection is it favors the survival of individuals that have the intermediate phenotypes. The extreme values of a trait get selected against, right? So let's check out this graph. What are we looking at here? I see a bird, and I see on the y-axis it says number of nests, and then on the x-axis there is a range of how many eggs a bird can lay, ranging from, they just put, they didn't get specific, but it ranged from few eggs to many eggs. And it looks like usually in the population, birds may sometimes lay few or some will lay many. There's variation into which birds lay how many eggs, right? So this is about clutch size. A clutch is the number of eggs that a bird lays. Okay? But what happens over time is stabilizing selection, because those birds that are laying too many eggs, the offspring die off because the parents can't care for too many offspring. They have to find a lot of food to bring back to a lot of chicks. So those birds that were producing too many eggs were not able to care for those offspring. So those offspring would die out, and so the allele for laying a lot of eggs would die out with them. On the opposite side, those birds who don't lay many eggs, that it's not enough to contribute to the next generation. There's, if only a couple survive, then they may not be able to find each other to really pass on that trait. So that may be more of less opportunity to mate. So that trait may die out. In the middle, it seems like then it starts to stabilize, and those who are producing an intermediate number of eggs experience more success and a better ability to mate and pass that trait on of producing an intermediate amount of eggs. So that's stabilizing selection. Again, it's the extreme values of the trait that are being selected against or dying out. It doesn't have a benefit in the environment. So stabilizing selection. The next one is disruptive selection, or sometimes called diversifying selection, because you might get more of a diversity of traits in the environment. So this type of selection is more likely to occur in populations that occupy what we would call heterogeneous environments, meaning that there's a lot of change occurring in the environment or a lot of differences within the same environment. So usually what happens here, members of populations can freely interbreed with one another, but there's a trend in several directions of selection rather than just one. So this is also, it's a special form of directional selection, but instead of selecting in one direction, again, several directions are being selected for. Okay, this was kind of a example we can see in those Galapagos finches when we looked at character displacement and resource partitioning. In that example, we looked at two different species, but that also we know has occurred in the same species. So again, in Galapagos finches, there's a condition where finches have a broad range in the size of beaks that they can have within a population. But due to a drought, we know this has happened, a drought came along, and it kind of separated the food resources into two different types. You could eat seeds, or there were wood-boring beetles in the barks of trees. So if you had the thinner, longer beak on one extreme of the range of beak sizes, it was easier to get the boring beetles. If you had a thicker beak on the other end of the range, you could get the seeds. But if you had an intermediary beak size, you weren't very good at getting beetles or seeds. So what happened is we started to see this character displacement occurring. And in the same species, you start to see some have small beaks, some have large beaks. Okay. Over time, if that keeps occurring and they begin to isolate from one another and they can't interbreed, then we might see a new species. But in this case, in disruptive selection or diversifying selection, that's one of the assumptions, is that the individuals can interbreed, and so they don't speciate out right away. Okay. The other picture you see there with the plants, this is showing a type of plant, Agrostis capillaris. This is a plant that can survive in very acidic soils or very neutral soils. So again, extreme changes in the environment favors the survival of two or more different genotypes. So the genotype may have been that, or the environment may have been that it was more neutral and the plant could survive there. But then a pollution spill came in, really acidifying the environment. So now there's some areas of the soil where it's neutral and other areas of the soil where it's very acidic. Well, some of the individuals in this area could adapt to that acidic soil because they had the genes for it. So now we see in the population these two frequencies: the number that can live in metal sensitive areas or the acidic soils, and those that are resistant to it. And so we have more of a diversity of traits going on there. Okay, the next one, balanced selection, which is also, you might hear the term balanced polymorphism. So poly means many, and again, morphism means the trait or what's being expressed. Okay, and so what we see is a balance in the different types of traits that can be expressed. And this means that two or more alleles are kept in balance, and they're maintained in the population over many generations. This type of selection usually maintains genetic diversity. And so basically what we might consider the weaker gene or the less fit gene, they're not always eliminated out of the population, because in some instances they do confer a benefit to the environment. So what ends up happening is that two or more alleles end up being kept in balance with one another and maintained in the population over many generations. So an example of that is something that evolved due to the incidence of malaria. So here you see the continent of Africa, and it's showing you areas where malaria is common. And then in the other one, it's showing you the frequency of an allele for sickle cell. And we refer to that as H with a little s at the top, at the superscript. That the H is referring to hemoglobin. And sickle cell is a disease that affects hemoglobin. It's a genetic mutation in the hemoglobin, and what happens is it affects a person's ability for the hemoglobin in your blood cell to bind oxygen. And so the way the normal situation works is a red blood cell can bind oxygen. Oxygen will enter the red blood cell, bind to hemoglobin. Hemoglobin carries it. And then when we need oxygen, hemoglobin will release that oxygen and go to the tissues and whatever organ needs that oxygen molecule. But then the blood is able to travel back to the lungs and pick up more oxygen and attach it to that same hemoglobin molecule. With the sickling trait, however, due to that genetic mutation, is that when the red blood cell is first produced in the body, it can pick up oxygen normally. But then when it travels around the body and releases that oxygen molecule, the protein, the hemoglobin protein, actually changes shape and it becomes rigid. And so the red blood cell, instead of being round, it becomes a sickle shape, like a C. And it becomes rigid, it's not flexible. So two things happen. It's unable to bind oxygen again. So people with the sickle cell cannot get enough oxygen that they need. And then also because it's rigid, it doesn't pass through the very small capillaries very easily, and so it can clog up in there and then prevent blood flow to particular organs. And that clogging of the sickled cells can be painful as well. So people who are homozygous for the sickling trait tend not to live very long because they're always anemic. They're not able to carry a lot of oxygen and the pain that goes along with it, or the blockage of the blood that goes along with it. But people who are heterozygous for it, what happens is some of their red blood cells are normal. They don't have the sickling trait in them, but other red blood cells are not normal. But here's the part why even heterozygotes, they actually have a advantage in the areas of Africa, and also we saw this in India, where malaria is common. So malaria is a blood-borne disease produced from a parasite. A mosquito, when it bites you, injects you with this parasite, and it breeds inside of your red blood cells. And that can cause intense fevers and things, and that can also cause death as well. But what happened is people who are heterozygous for sickle cell, the parasite cannot survive in the sickled cell. So that is showing people who are heterozygous have a benefit of preventing, of not getting malaria. And so the heterozygous sickling trait is actually beneficial to them and prevents them from getting malaria. And so there's a balanced selection going on there. Individuals who don't have the sickle trait are in danger of catching malaria and dying. Those that do have at least heterozygous from the sickle trait do not catch malaria. However, the homozygous trait, again, it's too severe and individuals don't tend to survive over time. So that's balanced polymorphism or balanced selection. What we would consider as the weaker gene or the less fit gene of the sickle cell is not eliminated out of the population because it does confer a benefit in the environment. So the two or more alleles are kept in balance. So the sickled allele and the regular hemoglobin allele. Okay, the last type of selection I want to go over, and this one's kind of fun. This one's sexual selection. So it's a form of natural selection. We don't look at it on a graph, but what it does is it really affects genotype frequencies within a population, and this is due to non-random. So when we study populations, we go into it making certain assumptions about a population, and then by making those certain assumptions, we can see where the population deviates from those assumptions, and that gives us clues as to what's going on. So most populations, we think there's random mating going on. Just means that a male and a female, whoever they are, pop, come across one another, and they have babies. You guys can fill in the middle part that I skipped. And again, it might be easier to think of that. It's funny to think of that in human populations, but remember your insects and plants and things like that. But we do know that a lot of animal species display sexual selection. And so what they're doing is individuals are choosing each other's as mates depending on certain traits that they have. So it's not random mating. They're actually making a choice that one individual might see as advantageous in the environment, whether it really is or not. But if they perceive that it is, they'll want to mate with that individual in order to pass that trait on to their offspring. Now, usually this affects male characteristics more than females because females tend to be more choosy in the animal world. And the reason, mainly, there's several reasons, but one of the main reasons seems to be because of the energy it requires to produce an egg as compared to sperm. Okay, and I'm not just talking birds' eggs, but I'm also talking, human eggs that are very microscopic. Eggs take a lot of energy from the female in order to produce, because an egg not only contains the genetic contribution from the female in the nucleus, but it also contains all the other cellular machinery needed for the embryo and then the fetus and the individual to grow. So everything else inside your cell, the organelles and things, come from mom. And that takes more energy to package that into an egg. In contrast, sperm contains the DNA from the father. And that's the only contribution to the offspring. Only. It's a big contribution. It's half your genes. But again, the rest of the cellular machinery that's going into your cells comes from mom. So therefore, males can produce a lot more sperm at any given time. Females don't produce a lot of eggs. So, I mean, think about it. Human females are fertile for a few days out of every month, right? Panda bears are fertile for a few days once a year. Okay? And so, again, it just depends on the process of making the egg. Whereas males of most species of animals can produce millions of sperm every day. Okay, so if you're a female and you're looking at a male and you think that that male doesn't have traits that would be that if those traits are passed on to your offspring, that it wouldn't allow them to survive in the environment, well, you may not want to waste an egg on that male, right? You're going to find a male all the energy that went into producing the egg, and usually females also provide more parental care, probably because of the energy it took to make that egg. So you're not going to waste a lot of energy on offspring that didn't obtain good traits. Okay? Whereas a male, he may not be as choosy, because if he wastes some sperm on an inferior female, you go mate with another female. I can hear the laughter out there, right? This is animal behavior. This is sexual selection. So here are some examples. So there can actually be different types of sexual selection. So the one I was referring to mostly is intersexual selection, the picture in the middle here. And peacocks are a really good example of that. So with intersexual selection, it means there's selection going on between the sexes. So usually females are choosing which males to mate with, and the males are working for it. They're trying to show off that they would be a good choice. There are some species where it can happen the other way around, but most often it's the females choosing the male. So think about it. You're a male peacock. You have these long feathers. They can be 3 or 4 feet long, and you have a lot of them, and they're brightly colored. So is that going to be an advantage in the environment with slowing you down and advertising to predators? You're more likely to be caught by a predator. So why would a female choose that? It's possible she's seeing that as, hey, this male carrying those heavy feathers is still alive. He must have some good genes to get away from predators. It also, you have to be pretty healthy to maintain feathers like that and the colors of those feathers. Bright feathers means the individual is healthy. And so females may be looking at that as a way to say, I'm going to get some good genes for my offspring to be able to combat diseases. So that's intersexual selection. We start to see that over time, the males that are being chosen have these exaggerated traits, and that's what gets passed on to the offspring. Females tend not. Females then tend to stay more of the drab color because there is no selection on their side. Also think about like horns in sheep, antlers in like a male moose, that kind of thing. So females tend to be selecting for those kind of things. Okay. In the first one is intrasexual selection. And so this is where it's the same sex that are actually conferring an advantage or competing, having a trait that helps them compete better for mating opportunities or territories. So this first one for intrasexual selection is showing a fiddler crab with a really large claw. So again, just in a population, there's individual variation. You can have big claws or small claws. Well, the males with the larger claws are more intimidating, and it might chase off the males with the smaller claws, and they're around, and the females are going, all right, I'll mate with you. You're here, right? And so over time, the larger claw is being selected for because it has more of an advantage for competition. So, I mean, that even, I gave the example with male deer and things, that can also be an intrasexual selection too. But in both cases, sexual selection is going to be balanced by predation. There's going to be a point where the feathers are too long and a predator is going to catch them. So that's going to put a limit on that phenotype. There's going to be a point where a male crab claw is too big and it's too heavy. He can't get away as well. So predators might then kind of put a limit to how big those traits can get. Here's some more pictures. We see a lot of sexual selection really exaggerated in birds. So you can see the bird on the left is a quetzal. The males have these really long tail feathers. That's got to be hard to fly in the environment in a forest, in the tropical rainforest like that. Look at the one in the right at the top. That looks like a female with the large bra size. That's actually a male. This is a prairie hen. And he's got these beautiful feather adornments on his tail, his head, and even the large bra size there. That's attractive to females. And so that gets exaggerated. But again, you could see that out on the prairie, that would be easy for predators to see. But it's conferring a sexual selection. Females are choosing him to mate, so he's passing his genes on. We can see it in insects. You can see it in a lot of different animals. I posted on Canvas some videos to show you some of the traits that can develop from sexual selection. Look at this one. This is a widow bird. How can a 2 to 3 foot long tail feathers, that would seem to slow down how fast you could fly. But again, there's a range where females are choosing that, and so that's a mating advantage in their population. Okay, that's it. Thanks, everybody. I hope you've learned a lot about population genetics, so please watch this video again and use the information on Canvas.